Hi, friends. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the Dominican Republic and sharing an overview from pre Columbian times until today, in hopes that this helps to provide a framework for what you're going to experience and hear when you visit the ILAC Center and serve our communities here in the DR. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint presentation that I'll be using to guide our conversation. And at the end, I am going to make public my email so that you can feel free to contact me with any questions or any comments that you have after watching this video. My name is Margarita Dubac, and I work for the ILAC office at Creighton from here, from the Dominican Republic. So the first inhabitants on this island, which we call Hispaniola, were the Taino Arawaks. They were a group of indigenous people that were considered to be the least aggressive of all the pre-Columbian societies, and they were artisans by trade. They hunted and fished to make a living, and also as a way of providing for themselves. And they were very egalitarian in nature. They were family oriented and share all their property. And they came to this island from modern day Venezuela via boat. It is believed that there were other indigenous groups that were all kind of visiting the Caribbean islands, but it was the Taino Arawaks who eventually settled both here in the island of Hispaniola, but also in the Greater Antilles. And then in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and quote unquote discovered this island of Hispaniola. And I'm using quotation marks because this island already existed. And in fact, the Tainos, the indigenous people, had come before. As I said, they came from modern day Venezuela. So Columbus and his people weren't the first to find this new piece of land. During this time, or in this first trip, Columbus came through the northern part of the Dominican Republic in a province called Puerto Plata, in a town that he named La Isabela after the Queen of Spain, and left a settlement of people before returning to Spain to gather more supplies and more people to come back. And Columbus eventually made 4 different trips to this island. It's important to note that in his first trip to the New World in 1492, Columbus first had a pit stop in modern day Bahamas and then a pit stop in modern day Cuba. But it was here in Hispaniola where he eventually settled and created a structure, which is why if you get a chance to visit the colonial zone in our capital city of Santo Domingo, you will get a tour where they tell you that we have the first street in the Americas, the first cathedral, the first university, and so forth, as this was the first settlement in the New World from the Europeans. It's also important to know a little bit about what was happening in Spain prior to Columbus's arrival to this island. And it's that they had just won an 800-year battle against the Moors over control for the Iberian Peninsula. So this gave them a very militaristic zeal and a belief that they were commissioned by God to spread Christianity throughout the world. So they very much came in this expedition hoping to spread that Christian faith. And slowly but surely started to forcibly convert the indigenous people to Catholicism. But they also were looking for profit for the Spanish crown. And part of the reason that attracted them to this island was seeing the gold ornaments that the indigenous were wearing. So their first economic venture was to exploit the gold mines. And eventually they also introduced sugar cane onto this island, and its production became a prominent economic feature. As the indigenous people were not used to this kind of forced labor, they slowly started becoming extinct. In addition to, because of the labor, because of diseases that the Spanish brought with them that they weren't immune to. Also at the beginning, there were some fights between the indigenous and the Spaniards that led to some of them dying, and some even committed collective suicides to escape the slavery to which they were being subjected. So within 60 years or so of colonization, they all became extinct. And as they were dwindling in numbers, the Spaniards also started bringing in African slaves onto this island to continue the labor that the indigenous were no longer capable of doing. And this created the mixture of races and the cultural mixture that we see in this country till this day. It's important that I also mention, as we talk about that mixture, that this island used to be one, as I said at the beginning, called Hispaniola. But due to fights in Europe uh, between the different countries, and them using the Caribbean islands as the pawns in the chess game of those wars, eventually this island was divided into two, with the western part, the western 1/3 of the island being controlled by France, and the eastern 2/3 of the island being controlled by Spanish. And they had very different approaches to their colonies here. Like I said before, the Spaniards settled here, and they stayed here. And they also wanted to mirror very much their lives in Spain here. So one of the things that they tried to maintain was always to have a numerical majority in the mix of all these other people that were around, the indigenous, the African slaves, and eventually the mestizos or mulattoes, who were the mixtures of some of those races through marriage. And every time the Spaniards saw that numerically they were no longer the majority, they would offer a piece of land to Spanish peasants to come and populate areas of this side of the island, so that they would always maintain a numerical majority here. Meanwhile, for France, modern day Haiti, which is what their colony was just an economic venture for them. So they never focused on settling there. And instead, oftentimes, they had a 1-to-5 ratio between French person and slave. It's also important to know that by the time that France got in the mix, the indigenous were extinct. So they were only accounting with the African slaves, which is what makes the racial composition of modern day Haiti to be slightly different than the Dominican Republic in that regard, in terms of how many races encompass their original inhabitants. And as France declared the French Revolution and promoted ideals of equality, fraternity among their people, those ideals slowly trickled down to their colony here in modern day Haiti. And this led to a group of former slaves to unite and declare their independence from France on January 1st, 1804. And one of their fears was, of course, that this side of the island, the Spanish side of the island, remained a side where slavery was present. And the fear was that it could easily jeopardize their independence and their freedom. So in 1821, a man named Jose Nunez de Cáceres, among others, organized a group of Dominicans to declare independence from Spain. This is known as the Independencia Efímera, or short-lived independence, as it only lasted a few months. And this is also the beginning of where I'm going to show you how history is a subjective science. Unlike math and other natural sciences where they're objective, and in math, for example, 2 + 2 is going to be 4, no matter where in the world you are, history is a subjective science where it all depends on who tells the story, from what perspective, and with what intention. So this idea of our declaration of an ephemeris independence is taught slightly different in the Dominican Republic than it is in Haiti. In the Dominican Republic, is taught in the way that I share with you, and in Haiti, they're taught that they helped Jose Nunez de Cáceres and their men to start planting those ideals and to want to pursue that independence. But what's taught even more differently is this part. So following the failure of the Independencia Efímera, which, by the way, I always say more than half of Dominicans don't even remember that it existed, because we don't celebrate it at all. And there's not too much memorabilia for it as there is for the future independences that we've had. So in the DR, we are taught that when we were unsuccessful doing that, then Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer occupied the whole island for the next 22 years. Whereas in Haiti, they are taught that it was Jose Nunez de Cáceres and that group that wanted independence who asked the Haitians to come and help us be free from the European powers and abolish slavery here. I always say that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as I do believe that there was somewhat of an invitation and conversation between both parties, but perhaps the way that the next 22 years look like was not exactly how it was intended by both parties. So that's why I've also used quotation marks for the word occupation here. And in that transition, then different groups started to organize and seek Dominican independence now from Haiti. And a group succeeded in 1844, led by Juan Pablo Duarte's uh, Francisco del Rosario Sanchez, and Matias Ramon Mella, who are three founding fathers and the ones that are revered to this day and whose names you're going to see on streets, on the money, and on different monuments throughout the country. And they declared independence from Haiti on February 27th, 1844. Then our first constitutional president, Pedro Santana, voluntarily annexed us to Spain. And I've used quotation marks with the word voluntarily again, because this was not a decision that was popular by the majority. In fact, a civil war erupted immediately after that because the people did not want to lose their independence again. So it was only a popular decision by Santana and his close circle that were seeking benefits and protection from Spain. So this civil war that emerged led to the War for Restoration of Independence that lasted between 1863 and 1865, when eventually our independence was restored from Spain under the auspices of leaders such as Gregorio Luperón. And one fun fact is that the monument that you will see when you visit the ILAC Center that is here in the city of Santiago is the monument to the heroes of the Restoration of Independence, because one of the main fights for that war was fought in the city of Santiago. And that symbol is an icon here in Santiago and symbolizes our city, much like you would say the Golden Gates symbolize San Francisco. What followed the Restoration of Independence were 36 different presidential periods lasting from 1865 to 1916. Now, you don't have to be too much of a math whiz to know that if our presidential periods like yours are 4-year long, this period of time is a little shorter than 36 times 4. And the reason for this is that many of these terms were not finished, but instead presidents were ousted in coups overthrown by one another. Another thing is that there weren't 36 different men, and I'm using the word men purposely because we haven't had a female president yet, but instead we had what I like to call repeat offenders. So people like actually Santana, our first constitutional president, and others served multiple terms during this period of time. And the other pieces that characterized this period of time were that it was a time of economic stagnation. Many of these presidents acquired large foreign loans that now haunted the Dominican Republic. And we had the ongoing fight between the strongman leaders that actually fancied themselves as leaders, but in reality were only despots. So here's a picture from the cathedral in the colonial zone in Santo Domingo, just to give you a break from hearing me talk and to give you an image of what I was talking about with the first settlement here in the Americas. And you will see that there's a picture or a statue of Columbus in the park pointing, and it's pointing to the north to the first settlement that he had in this northern side of the island. We have a love and hate relationship with Columbus, much like it happens with the United States, where there's the awareness of maybe the challenges with his quote unquote discovery of the New World, but we still celebrate him in many ways, such as having these kinds of statues. But I always like to joke saying that the statue gets constantly pooped on by pigeons, so maybe that's how he's getting his fate. So coming back to the history, after the 36 presidential periods in the large foreign loans that we acquired, we had the Marines land on the island on this side of the island in 1916. It's noteworthy to know that they had already landed in modern day Haiti in 1915, so a year before. And the reasoning given for this occupation was precisely those loans that we owe not only to the United States, but also to European powers. So using as a shield piece of legislation such as the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, where essentially we're giving restraining orders to Europe saying not to mess with the Americas. It is believed that the United States occupied the Dominican Republic in an effort to prevent European powers from trying to come and collect their debt by taking over again. Prior to this occupation, the United States had already taken control of Dominican customs to try to start collecting some of that money, but then they wanted the Dominican government to implement a series of economic measures that the Dominican government declined to do, and this is when the Marines landed and stayed for the next 8 years. And there were some positives and some negatives during this period of time. Positives included some development and especially infrastructure, building for the country. There are questionable things such as the dismantling of our police force that was replaced with a US trained military that eventually led to the rise of our future dictator. The population was disarmed, given all control to that military, which I always find interesting and ironic considering the ongoing debate over gun control in the United States to this day, and so forth. And there were some cultural things that also emerged from this time. As the Marines left, they organized elections, and Horacio Vasquez was elected president in 1924. He was considered a great president, but his health wasn't the greatest. And the other thing that occurred to him is that he faced the person that was left as the head of the military as the Marines left, who eventually became our dictator, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina. And what Trujillo did is that he climbed up the ladder of the military during the occupation, like I said, eventually being left as the head of the military. And he did what the military was not supposed to do. The military is supposed to be an apolitical force that supports the president and the executive power, but instead he used the power of being the head of the military to not have any competition so he could run for office in 1930, and even for Horacio Vasquez to no longer be a competition by just creating the space for him to be the sole competitor. So he won that election and proceeded to become a dictator for the next 31 years. It's important to know that on paper, he wasn't president that whole time. There were a couple of times when he named puppet presidents to give an allure of democracy. And those times usually were moments when he had gotten into trouble with the international community for one thing or the other. In fact, at the time of his assassination on May 31st, 1961, there was a puppet president serving in office instead of him. And one thing to note, and it connects to this image that I have here in the top of these three statues, is that it was the assassination of these three sisters, known as the Mirabal sisters, that is believed to have been the last drop that broke the camel's back and that led to the eventual assassination of Trujillo. They were murdered on November 25th, 1960, and although it was not officially proven, it was everybody's understanding that this was an action sent forth by Trujillo, as them and their husbands were main leaders of the opposition movement against the dictatorship. And now the day of their assassination is known as the International Day Against Violence Towards Women. So following Trujillo's assassination, we organized eventually free elections. There was a little bit of a transition there because folks who were alive at the time say that people didn't know for sure if they could trust that the dictatorship was truly over. So it took a while to organize, and elections were organized in 1962, and Juan Bosch was elected president with an overwhelming majority of over 60% of the votes. It's important to know that Juan Bosch had been an opponent of Trujillo from exile. He spent a lot of time in Cuba during Trujillo's regime, and that he came as a candidate with very Marxist-oriented ideals. So he was quickly deposed in a military coup only about 7 months after assuming office. It is believed that with the support of the United States. So I wanted to think of what was happening at the time in the world and the Cold War and the fear of communism spreading. So the belief is that the U.S. did not want to jeopardize having a second Cuba so close to its shores, and that one Bush's time in exile in Cuba and his leftist ideals were too much of a risk to gamble. So because he had won with over 60% of the votes, this ousting of Juan Bush was not popular, and instead a civil war erupted in the country. So the Marines landed once again in 1965 to calm down the population following the Civil War. This was a very short invasion, which only lasted as long as to calm the situation and organize elections again. And Joaquin Balaguer was elected president in 1966. It's important to note that Joaquin Balaguer had been part of Trujillo's inner circle, and in fact, he was the puppet president at the time of Trujillo's assassination. But it is believed that this first set of terms under Balaguer's auspices were a pseudo transition between dictatorship and democracy. There were elections every 4 years, very contended elections indeed, but there were some traits of still imposition, especially against the press and not having too much freedom of press. But Balaguer managed to win the next 3 elections and govern for 12 years in what is known as the infamous 12 years of Balaguer. Then in 1978, he did lose the elections to the Dominican Revolutionary Party. And for the next 2 terms, we had presidents from that party. The first president, Antonio Guzman, committed suicide a few months before finishing his time in office. Many believe that over shame for corruption scandals in which some of his close acquaintances and even family members were involved. And then he was followed by Salvador Jorge Blanco, who is the only president in Dominican history who has been accused, tried, and found guilty of corruption and therefore served time in jail for it. Not the only one who deserves it, but the only one who has suffered that fate precisely because he was a main opponent to Balaguer. So he managed to prosecute him when he won office the following year. So Balaguer was reelected president in 1986, and he governed for the next 10 years. Now, I've told you that our presidential periods are 4-year long, just like they are in the United States. So 10 is not a multiple of 4. And the reason for that is that many of Balaguer's elections were contested for corruption. And the last one was considered to be so bad that there was an intervention done where a deal was cut with him that he would only govern for 2 years, and that our constitution will be changed for the first time to prohibit immediate re-election. Even Jimmy Carter came to be part of those negotiations, so it was a big ordeal. And it's noteworthy to know that we haven't banned forever re-elections, so it's not like folks cannot run several years later, but at this point it was just an immediate term that he couldn't run for. So in 1996, he couldn't run for office, and many believe that he handpicked his successor, Leonel Fernandez, who belonged to a different party than his. Leonel Fernandez belonged to the Dominican Liberation Party, and Balaguer supported him instead of the candidate from his own party. It is believed that this was done because Congress still had 2 more years to serve, and the Congress was overwhelmingly from Balaguer's party. So some believe that Balaguer wanted to still have some degree of control from behind the scenes. Leonel did his 4 years in office, didn't change the Constitution, and then in the year 2000, a different person from his party ran, but instead Hipólito Mejia from the Dominican Revolutionary Party won and was elected president. This is the same party from the 2 presidents in between Balaguer's 2 terms or 2 blocks of terms. And I always like to point out, even though with this I'm going to be dating myself, that Hipólito's terms was a time that I spent at Creighton as an undergraduate student, because our presidents take office in August. So I left for the US in August of 2000, just a few days before Hipólito started his term, and $1 was 18 pesos. And when I came home for Christmas of that same year, $1 was 50 some pesos. So these 4 years of Hipólito were marked with a tremendous inflation and economic downturn for the country, not all of which were his fault, of course, because in 4 months you can't jeopardize the economy so much. Instead, three different banks declared bankruptcy during his term in office, which were carrying down from before, but perhaps the way that he handled this crisis was not the best, because at the time our currency was still a gold-based currency where we needed to have gold in our central bank to validate every bill that we had. And he printed money without having gold to back it up to solve some of the economic downturn from this crisis. So this led to the great inflation because it was almost a printing monopoly money since we didn't have the gold to validate it. But despite this, he changed the constitution, hoping to be able to serve another term, and change it to be something similar to what you have in the United States, where there will be 2 consecutive terms, and then they would have to sit it out again without banning forever re-election. Well, this backfired on him, and he lost in 2004, and instead Leonel Fernandez was elected again and benefited from Hipólito's change of the constitution, thus serving 2 consecutive terms. But before finishing office, he changed the constitution once again to take it back to only 1 term and not having consecutive re-election, because he wanted to only be out for a term before being able to run again for office. And Danilo Medina, the candidate from Leonel's own party, won in 2012. And even though some of his campaign promises were not to change the constitution, guess what? He did. So he won once again in 2016 and served in office until the year 2020, when Luis Abinader, a candidate from a brand new party that was founded in 2015 as a break off from the PRD party that Hipólito Mejía, Antonio Guzman, and Salvador Jorge Blanco were a part of, was elected president in elections that were organized in July of 2020 and took office in August of 2020. So the history is still being written on what this new term will look like. Abinader was considered the candidate for change. That was the whole slogan behind his campaign. And a lot of hope rested on his shoulders, given that we had the same party, Leonel and Danilo's party, in office for 16 consecutive years. So we shall see what this term looks like and what the future of the DR brings. So that's all I had for the history of the Dominican Republic. Again, if you have any questions or any comments that you want to make, feel free to email me at mdubac@creighton.edu, and I will be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I thank you for your time. Gracias. And I very much look forward to welcoming you in the Dominican Republic and the ILAC Center. Until then, bye.